Some families came from the Caribbean, some from Africa, and some have deeper roots here than the very people who claim otherwise. And some have deeper roots here than the very people who claim otherwise.
If you knew what you were made of, then we would save the world.
So this one's going to be a short but a good one. I came across this post in Instagram and I thought it was really good because it's very rare actually that we hear this kind of truth which goes very unspoken but is becoming increasingly relevant in our modern, increasingly racially stratified, fascist, historically ignorant and far right leaning society that we find ourselves in 2026, where people aren't historically literate. They don't really know what took place historically. So it was very refreshing to hear this, and I just thought I'd share it with you guys. Those of you who know me from my other channel know that I'm a bit of a history buff, so history is kind of like what I like to get into, and it was just nice to hear this message. So yeah, let me share it with you.
In response to all the racist nonsense on my page, I want to offer a simple reminder grounded in truth, history and integrity. No one is going back anywhere. Many Black Britons have been here for centuries. We had African diplomats in the 14th century, Black musicians and courtiers in King Henry VIII's court, and long established communities across Britain.
That is all facts. And the sad thing is people don't know this. I don't know how it is around the different diaspora communities across the rest of the world. Actually, I know many of them, but there's very kind of broken apart stories and very different stories about Black people in different parts of the world and what their origin points are. In terms of the UK, we have this kind of perspective, which is correct in many ways, that we had this arrival called the Windrush, where essentially people came from the Caribbean to the UK as part of a fulfillment of a pact that was made to the soldiers of the West India Regiment to patriate or repatriate, but we won't talk about that right now, blacks who were in the Caribbean and bring them over to the UK. So we had this thing called the Windrush, and then since then there's been immigration directly from Africa. My mum migrated over in one of the early immigrations from Nigeria, which is why my family is here now. And for a lot of people, that's it. That's the kind of like full stop point. That's it. That explains all coloured people in the UK. They all came over recently after the war. The problem is that's not substantiated. If you go back through British history, there's never a time in British history where you don't see Black people. And I'm not talking about just kind of like scattered one or two people. Even some of the earliest genetic studies that are being done now, where a lot of the time people who were darker are actually passed off as being white. But even those studies are having to acknowledge the fact that they've got some indisputable West African DNA going back as far as kind of like, 700 AD. And even before then, they've got people who are physiognomically, in other words, have the, present as Black people going back to BC times and early AD. And this would predate the modern people who call themselves British. This predates their migration because they are also migrants. British history is a history of migrant stories. So it's really interesting and actually quite refreshing to hear about these stories, some of these names of Black groups and Black people who are essentially, you'd have to classify as Black British, but they're few and far between. And that's because the British establishment, the British system, British education, it doesn't give any room for there to be anything other than Black African and Black Caribbean. In fact, those are the only choices you'll get. So when we're growing up, we're Black, we're either African or Caribbean, and there's no room for any middle ground. They don't even really like to give the Black British pass out too much. But this doesn't match British history. There were Black Brits who fought in the war, and you can see them in pictures. There were pre-war photographs of Black people in the major cities and the major hubs, the urban centres as they were called, all over England. There are Black populations in Bristol, Black populations in Liverpool. And there are many, many books where you can find this kind of information, and more being published each day. I've got a few here. One of my favourite books to look into is Ancient and Modern Britons, and this book actually goes as far as to say the indigenous of the UK were blacks. They were the indigenous populations. The Picts were a black group, and it's very, very interesting to read this. Dave McRitchie, who's a historian, this book was written in the late 19th century. Very, very interesting book about the origins of the British people. Then you've got more recent researchers such as Onyeka Nubia, who has this book England's Other Countrymen, which is very, very interesting, covers the same topic. We also have Miranda Kaufman, who's done this book Black Tudors, and I mean, her approach is much more establishment, i.e. suggesting that everybody has recent African ancestry, but I think once again you could still get a bit of useful information from that. Then we got this book by Gretchen Gerzner called Black England, which is really quite informative. This book here, which comes in a series by Lee Cummings, is called The Negro Question, and that actually looks at the black nobility. So that looks at black people who were part of royalty in the UK. And I cover quite, well, I'm going into more detail now, but I cover quite a bit of that on my channel, my other channel called The King's Monologue as well, where we are starting more and more to look at black nobility and black presence in Europe. But I just think it's a really interesting subject, and I'm so glad that she kind of touches on it as a part of her response to what is becoming a very binary conversation across the world right now, but particularly in Europe, where people are trying to say we as whites are the only people who can classify ourselves as Europeans or Brits or whatever it is, and everybody else is foreigners. And actually, British history, European history has never been black and white. And I think she's communicated this quite well. Let me let her finish.
Some families came from the Caribbean, some from Africa, and some have deeper roots here than the very people who claim otherwise. Some have deeper roots here than the very people who claim otherwise.
That's the deep thing. Some of these migrations that I'm talking about, or these kind of groupings of people, even the Romans that came over, we know that Ivory Bangle lady was a black woman. So there's many groups that came over that were black, and they predate the arrival of the people who classify themselves as the indigenous people here. People that some of them predate Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and some of the Anglo-Saxons have presented as black, and many of them predate the Germanic arrival, who are the kind of like the modern group who classify themselves as being English. So it's all very interesting.
There's always been more diverse, more interconnected, more enriched by different cultures than any history book ever taught us. As somebody whose ancestry is as English as it gets, aristocracy, empire, all of it, I believe in taking accountability for the truth. Britain's wealth and power was built in part on colonisation, extraction.
And what's important about what she says here, she says she comes from kind of aristocratic ancestry. And I think that's part of the reason why she's in the know. One of the things I've realised is that there are more people who are aware of Britain's very mixed, convoluted racial ancestry and history. It's something that actually reveals itself more at the levels of aristocracy and nobility, and is much more accessible than it is in the commonplace. Yes, you can look at certain artists such as William Hogarth, who used to regularly depict people of different ethnicities in his paintings in the urban centres, showing that they were a part of integrated 16th and 17th century British society. We can look at, I mean, they're just always there. They're always there in artwork if you go to museums. But I find that people who are perhaps in the aristocracy, people who have kind of access to nobility, they see these paintings. They see these paintings of black people alongside the nobility, and it raises always interesting question marks.
Princess Michael of Kent wore a blackamoor brooch to Meghan's first Christmas event, and people were outraged because they consider that a racial slur. Now, Meghan is of mixed race. Blackamoor art is found in many places. It's found in furniture, in art on the walls, and it was a very common thing, and most of it was made in the 1600s and 1700s, but it
depicted with a brooch with a Moor on it, with a black person on it, and she was rebuked for it because obviously the media jumped on and said, "Oh, racism," which is what they always like to say. "Oh, she was being derogatory." It's like, no, That was a hearken to Moorish ancestry. That wasn't her being racist or her being derogatory. And obviously the royal family have to keep stum about this, but every now and then they allow these little things to slip out, which show their linking to that noble class of indigenous black people in the UK. And there's a reason why they do that, you know. So it kind of reminds me of the Drake jewel, and where you have this brooch which clearly is depicting someone of nobility, a black person of nobility, who's at the front of this jewel. And there's a reason why this was given to Queen Elizabeth. And you have actually a series of these jewels that look like Drake's jewels that can be found across Europe. So there's this big underlying story of not just the UK but Europe having this integration with black people and always having this contact that has been hidden. So it's just nice to hear someone who has, you know, an aristocratic background being transparent about that and actually saying we can have a conversation about this, so that we don't have these silly binary conversations about, you know, shipping people off and getting rid of them and making England white again. Because the reality is the integrated England that you see now is what England has always been.
And the destruction of ancient civilizations across Africa and the Caribbean. We have to be honest about that to heal. And with honesty comes responsibility to do better. So
there you go, that was the end of it. I had to put it in my story, that was the reason for the sudden end. But I just thought that was a interesting video that I wanted to share with you guys. One of my favorite books, Nature Knows No Color Lines. I don't know where it is at the moment. It might be downstairs in my living room. I'm always leaving my books in various different places, but like I said, there's loads of books you can get. I've only shown you like a handful of them, the ones that I could just literally grab from around me. But it's not like this is a fringe subject. There are authors that are producing books about this subject, about the black presence, people in the UK who are black, who are at different levels of society, from the general population right up to the aristocracy, have always been mentioned, have always been depicted. And there are even some characters in history who you have been tricked into believing they were white and they were actually black. So no, we're not going anywhere, first of all. But secondly, I might, because I'm getting kind of sick of this country. But anyway, but generally speaking, no, we're not going anywhere. But also that diversity that you see in UK, that's actually archaic, and that actually is what makes the UK historically what the UK has always been. So there, you heard it from the horse's mouth, not just from me. Hope you enjoyed that. Catch you on the next one. Peace.
If you knew what you